The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Today is Friday, September 23rd. I'm Donna Will, Professional Development Coordinator for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to DDA's Friday's webinar on Federal Community Settings Rule. Our presenters for today are Lisa Tolan, Office of Long-Term Services and Supports, Leslie Stuziak, Director of Provider Services, Dr. Yamonja Smalls, Director of Professional Staff Development, Nick Burton, Director of Programs, Rhonda Workman, Director of Federal Programs and Integrity. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options for listening to the webinar, by computer and by phone. And if you have trouble hearing, you can try switching by clicking on the appropriate button on the audio section of the webinar panel. There are 3 handouts for this webinar, and you can download them in the panel in the handout section, which is to the right of your screen. We are recording the webinar and we'll post it on YouTube on the DDA website. Questions can be typed in the question or chat box, and we'll get to those towards the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce Leslie Stuziak, Director of Provider Services. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Donna. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. We want to welcome all of you to today's webinar regarding the timelines and proposed enhanced processes related to the HCBS final rule compliance. First off, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for the postponement of our time together from Monday until today. We really appreciate everyone's flexibility. Before we get started, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that every single one of us on this call have a shared vision regarding the spirit of HCBS. And, we are confident that we are all working together to continually strengthen our person-driven system. The department will continue to collaborate and ensure trust and transparency to inform these processes. And, this work does not and will not happen in silos. So today's presentation is going to be informative and offers an opportunity for all of you to provide feedback as we continue to finalize the processes as we move forward. Excuse me. We look forward to working collaboratively with Medicaid, providers, and CCS agencies to ensure full HCBS compliance by March 17th of 2023. Next slide, please. So just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about this morning, first we're going to go through a summary of HCBS, just to talk about, kind of get our feet under us in this conversation. Then we're going to talk about a timeline to full compliance, a summary of progress, what we've done up until now. Then we're going to go over our proposed enhanced processes. We're also going to take a deeper look at the community settings questionnaire, go over action items, resources, and then as Donna said, at the end, there's going to be opportunity for comments and questions to help finalize these processes. So now I'm going to pass it over to Lisa Toland, Chief Division of Provider Enrollment, Claims and Compliance with the Office of Long-Term Services and Supports, to get us started and share an HCBS summary and timeline to full compliance. Lisa?
Good morning, everyone.
I'm sorry, Lisa, can you hold for a second? Donna, go back one slide. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. When we're talking about home and community-based settings, we're talking about people's homes or day programs. And the HCBS settings rule was established to ensure that people have a good quality of life. Maryland must be able to show that our policies and procedures reflect the settings criteria and that we've made efforts to implement the criteria. We are all working with all HCBS programs and CMS on a concrete time-limited plan to achieve compliance with the community settings rule. So there are 3 areas that we're looking for. This rule is for individuals receiving HCBS services to be able to fully integrate into the community. Community participation is a key component of the service delivery. We want to ensure privacy, dignity, and respect. We want to ensure that the settings operating policies are aligned with the regulatory criteria in a manner that will facilitate individual autonomy, thus independence and choice. Next slide. So here is the HCBS Community Settings Rule timeline. And I would like to mention that this timeline that you see is for a small percentage of providers who have not yet achieved compliance. We are highlighting the notification process, the remediation timeline and process, and the transition process to lead Maryland into full compliance with the Community Settings Rule. This process occurs after we have received the information from DDA. There's a determination made of the number of providers in one of three statuses. That would be compliant, non-compliant, and heightened scrutiny. Now, before I go any further, let's kind of unpack heightened scrutiny. CMS has identified three key factors that will be taken into account in determining whether a setting has the effect of isolating individuals who are receiving Medicaid HCBS from the broader community, and also due to a design or model of the service provision in the setting, individuals have limited, if any, opportunities for interaction with the broader community, including individuals not receiving Medicaid-funded HCBS. The setting restricts individual choice to receive services or to engage in activities outside of the setting, or the setting is located separate and apart from the broader community without facilitating an individual's opportunity to access the broader community and to participate in community services that would be consistent with the individual's person-centered plan. So as you see in this timeline, notifications are sent by email to the provider, informing them of the status. There's an identification of the existing area or areas of noncompliance, and the provider is placed in a non-compliance status. Providers are to develop a CSR remediation plan, Community Settings Rule remediation plan, to rectify any areas of noncompliance. The CSR remediation plan will be reviewed to determine compliance, and as you can see, this time period began in May. Determine the providers that remain to have areas of noncompliance of current regulations and move forward with the suspension process. It will identify the individual or individuals that would need to be moved by these suspensions. It would inform all parties of the transition process, providers, case management, representatives, and individuals involved. It will complete all transitions by the specified deadline. And finally, we will report to CMS the final assessments. Leslie Stuziak, Statewide Director of Provider Relations for the DDA, will now share the summary of progress to date, and then we'll both share the proposed enhanced process for review of the HCBS settings compliance. Leslie.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'd like to talk about what we have all done to work towards a mutual understanding of what HCBS compliance is and how to reach full compliance across the state in partnership with providers and the people we support. In 2014, we conducted national core indicator surveys to assess the outcomes of services provided to individuals and families. You know, the indicators address key areas of concern, including service planning, rights, community inclusion, choice, health and care coordination, safety, and relationships. Then in 2016, we are thankful that the providers completed residential and non-residential self-assessments. This really allowed us to all begin understanding where we were in our trajectory towards compliance. In 2017, the DDA teams visited homes and day program sites to confirm the learning shared through the provider self-assessments and provide technical assistance if needed. And then that same year, we began using the community settings questionnaire, referred to as the CSQ, at least once a year. Again, tying this important system transformation back to the people that we support. In 2022, sites were determined non-compliant or compliant based on the results of the community settings questionnaire, and providers with non-compliant sites received letters in June and July of this year. Next slide, please. So the past 8 years I just described, of learning and reflection achieved extremely positive outcomes. Based upon the most recent community settings questionnaire for each home or program site, out of 2,469 residential sites, only 77 were found to be non-compliant, or 3%. And of our 213 non-residential sites, 21 were found non-compliant, which is roughly 10%. And many of you are actively working to resolve those areas of non-compliance, so thank you. We know that the CSQ shows point-in-time compliance, and this data reflects what has been done to date. However, it's important to note that come March 17th, 2023, we aren't done, right? Community settings rule compliance is an ongoing collaborative process. So today, we are going to share the proposed visual processes that will enhance our policy, standard operating procedure, and training. And these processes, offer the opportunity for ongoing collaboration and technical support for all providers to remediate and maintain compliance. Next slide, please. So here is our proposed process flow at a 10,000-foot level, which is going to allow us to really enhance our final processes and guidance, as I just mentioned. I'm not going to focus on specific timelines. We know the timelines, and the details of this process will be enhanced based on your feedback from today's webinar. So let's start at the community settings questionnaire, the CSQ, which, as you know, captures the perspective of the person and relates to overall site compliance. Responses provided by the person are an opportunity for us to create a dialogue between the provider, the CCS, and the region to determine CSR compliance. CCSs are well positioned to encourage collaboration between people supported and providers as the CSQ is being completed. It's imperative that you, as the provider, know what is in the CSQ so that you can act on remediation promptly. It's also important that the DDA regional office is validating the answers in the CSQ to ensure accuracy. We want to work with providers and CCSs when there are areas of potential noncompliance identified so that we can remediate those immediately. This proposed enhanced process presents new touch points for validation and dialogue. Now, that being said, if there is an area of noncompliance that is unable to be remediated, DDA will be reporting that to Medicaid. This step is a requirement, and it demonstrates our collective commitment to holding our service system to a high standard of performance.
Leslie, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Donna, please go to the next slide. And Leslie, I'm going to ask you if you could restart this slide related to the proposed enhanced process. Callers are letting us know that we weren't showing the slides, so they were unable to follow you.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Rhonda. Excuse me. So, like I said, this is our proposed process flow, sort of at that 10,000-foot level. So this is going to allow us to enhance our final processes and guidance, as I mentioned in the previous slide. I'm not gonna go into specific timelines because we know the timelines, and then the details of this process will be enhanced based on your feedback from today's webinar. So starting at the CSQ, the Community Settings Questionnaire, which, as you know, captures the perspective of the person and relates to overall site compliance. Responses provided by the person are an opportunity for us to really create a dialogue between the provider, the CCS, and the region to determine CSR compliance. CCSs are really well positioned to encourage collaboration between people supported and providers as the CSQ is being completed. it's imperative that you as the provider know what is in the CSQ so that you can act on remediation promptly. And it's also important that the DDA regional office is validating the answers in the CSQ to ensure accuracy. You know, we want to work with providers and CCSs when there are areas of potential noncompliance identified so that we can remediate those immediately. So this proposed enhanced process presents new touch points for validation and dialogue. Now, that being said, if there is an area of noncompliance that is unable to be remediated, DDA will be reporting that to Medicaid. You know, this step is a requirement and it demonstrates our collective commitment to holding our service system to a high standard of performance. I'm now going to turn it back over to Lisa Toland so she can go over the next part in the process with you. Next slide, and I will turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you again, Leslie. So this is our proposed enhanced process flow. In this overall enhanced process, you will still see the three major areas and/or characteristics of heightened scrutiny. This includes sending out notifications to inform the setting of the status, including notifications of compliance, identifying those provider settings with areas of non-compliance, the notification to the provider if they are to go into a suspend status, then disenrollment status, and if needed, transitioning the individual. And this is done by informing the provider every step of the way, providing technical assistance every step of the way. It is the expectation of Maryland that we will continue to demonstrate progress towards compliance throughout the remaining transition period and also incorporate adequate engagement for the stakeholders throughout this enhanced process as this vision is being implemented for HCBS. And you will see the flow here to maintain ongoing compliance. Leslie will now walk you through the details of the community settings questionnaire.
Thank you, Lisa. Can you move to the next slide, please, Donna? Thank you very much. So to recap, we've talked about the CSQ data we have and what our proposed enhanced process is to utilize the CSQ as the means to drive the determination of compliance with the community settings rule. We have heard from many providers that some additional information is needed about the CSQ and the requirements for its completion. To recap it, and it can't be stated enough, our vision here is that the CSQ is completed in collaboration with the person, the CCS, and the provider, not in isolation. However, similar to our person-centered plans, it must reflect the perspective of the person, which may be informed by the person's team, such as a trusted support staff. For example, if a person is asked the question, can you have visitors at any time? And they answer no. This is an opportunity outside of the CSQ for the DDA to check in with the provider, and if they understand that to be the practice. This is the validation part of the process that I mentioned earlier. If the provider has a different perspective, this is a great opportunity to ensure all people supported are clear on the visitor policies. This may require the creative thinking you all do so well to identify the best way to share the visitor policy. This is the person-centered work of identifying the ways people learn best. Perhaps it's showing a person a written policy by prompting them to think about who they may want to invite over, or braiding the topic of having visitors into conversations as you and I do when we talk about our plans with friends. Think about ways to bring your policies to life. Next, the CSQ must be completed at least 1 year or within 30 days of a person moving into a new home or starting a new day program. This may seem stringent, but again, the CSQ is an opportunity to check in with the person to ensure that they understand their rights and situation. It's not simply a tool to, prove that the provider is in the wrong, you know, and it's not a gotcha tool, if you will, for providers. It's really a source of advocacy and empowerment as a tool for the people that you support. You know, finally, know that there is a specific CSQ for residential sites and non-residential sites, and we're going to go over those questions in detail. Next slide, please, Donna. So the next few slides, I'm going to share the CSQ questions in detail, and I'm going to start with the residential whose questions which fall into 5 main categories. So these categories are access to the greater community, rights of the person, privacy, and freedom. So this slide displays the questions pertaining to the first category, access to the greater community. These questions really get to the heart of the community settings rule. A person may not be living in an institutional setting, but it may feel like one to the person if they are isolated from people without disabilities. So the questions are, can the person seek employment if they want to? Is the person able to engage in their community the way they choose? You know, the types of activities, the frequency. Do they have control over their resources, access to their money? And, you know, did they choose where they live? The next category of rights gets to practices within the home and to make their own decisions. And please note that not all questions are yes or no answers. Some of them do require detailed narrative, which I'll flag as we go through the rest of the questions. So on the screen are the questions pertaining to rights of the person within the home. These help us understand if a person may be in a toxic or tolerated environment, or if they are in a supportive or healing environment. In terms of framing this as an opportunity for learning, keep in mind that what can feel toxic to one person may not feel that way to someone else in the very same environment. This is why these questions are important. You know, at a minimum, all of us want to live in a supportive environment. Next slide, please. Continuing with the rights section, the questions on the top of this slide are related to the right to make their own decisions with or without support pertaining to how services are delivered and where they live. Does the person feel they are able to make life choices independently with or without chosen support? Can they choose who provides their services, the staff that work with them? Are they aware they have a choice as to where they receive services and that they can change their services or providers if they want to? Do they have a lease or a legally enforceable agreement? And this is one of the most common areas of non-compliance we've seen, but also one of the most exciting opportunities for innovation and empowerment for the people that we support. The bottom half of this slide shows the questions related to privacy. You know, privacy is what makes us all feel a sense of comfort, control, consistency. Can they lock their door? This is the other most common area of noncompliance. If there are people on this call that struggle with this one, we'd really encourage you to reach out to your peers for tips. Similar to the lease agreements, there are some creative solutions out there, you know, just as an example, keyless door locks. Did they choose their roommate or have the option to their own room if they can afford it? Can they decorate their room how they wish? Next slide, please, Donna. The final category of the residential CSQ revolves around a person's freedom within their own home. It's always important to remember that people do not live where we work. We work where they live. These are their homes and should experience the same freedoms that you or I would in our own homes. These freedoms, you know, include controlling their own schedule. Do they do what they'd like to do when they'd like to? Do they have access to food at any time? Can they have visitors whenever they'd like? Are all aspects of their home physically accessible to them? And finally, do they have opportunities to interact with members of the community who do not receive services in a way that is meaningful to them and to the extent that they would like to? Next slide, please. Now I'm going to share the non-residential CSQ questions. You'll note many are similar or the same as the residential questions, and some are omitted from the non-residential simply as they don't apply to the program setting. The questions on this slide we've seen before, only revised to the day setting. Next slide, please. Again, we see similarities here with the rights in the residential setting. One flag is that even in a day program, a person does have the right to control their own schedule. The key is supporting choice and decision-making when starting the day and checking in throughout the day to ensure that the schedule is responsive to that person's needs. Next slide, please. So after the sets of questions in the CSQ, there are some additional prompts pertaining to verification of responses. The CCS should be notating what verification methods, emphasis on the plural, they used to gather this information in addition to speaking with the person supported. I want to reiterate that while this says verification should not be done solely through the provider, it does not mean that the provider is not or should not be included in the verification methods. Next slide, please. Now remember, no answers are going to be validated, but it will be very important that the necessary information and documentation is available so that validation can be consistent and transparent. So using the does the person have access to food when they want it question as an example. If you support someone with a Prader-Willi diagnosis, for example, it's likely there's already documentation about this in their PCP and details about what supports are in place, any behavioral support considerations or strategies, the approaches that have been tried, etc. Therefore, if the person answered no, we'll want to circle back to support them to understand why they do not have access to food, but the response in the CSQ will be a justified no, which will result in compliance. Next slide, please. In addition to what we just talked about, when there is a no answer in a CSQ, there should be data collection to measure the effectiveness of the support or supports that are in place. Time limits, documentation of informed consent of the person, and assurance that the intervention or support being implemented causes no harm to the person. This is very similar to a behavior support plan. Anytime we restrict the rights of a person, which is a no in the CSQ, we want to ensure there is a plan in place to reinstate those rights, or at a minimum, ensure the person and their support team is aware of and in agreement with the reason for the restriction. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So now we're going to just talk briefly about action items. I want to say that we really appreciate the time you've spent with us today and the comments and feedback questions you've brought to the table or will bring to the table in the rest of our time together. We are going to take all of that and use it to enhance our processes, procedures, and training so that you have the tools that you need that work for you. We look forward to our continued collaboration, and we thank you for all of the hard work you're doing and all of the success you've contributed to and will continue to contribute to our ultimate goal of maintaining compliance. We are going to gather final pieces, including remaining input from all stakeholders, and use that input to help finalize standard operating procedures and guidance related to implementation. And then lastly, utilize training on the CSQ, SOPs, and guidance as we move forward. Next slide, please. We can't say enough, thank you. You know, remember, we've said this a lot, but I don't think it can be overstated. We're here to collaborate. Our ultimate goal is to minimize the impact to the people that we support here in Maryland. We have a shared vision and values, which translates to this process as well as everything else that we do. Next slide, please. We've included a slide with some resources for you. Please feel free to take a look at those and you know, brush up on all things HCBS. And I think now we can move to comments and questions. Donna, if you want to go to the last slide. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Leslie and Lisa, for sharing information today. This has been a very wealth of information. I know that our audience is starting to give us some questions. So please, as a reminder, if you have questions, to add them into the question box so that we can look at them. We have received a few person-specific questions that we'll follow up offline, and we'll be addressing some of the questions specific to our information being presented today. So the first question, Leslie, is, are there specific coordinators of community services, or our CCSs, the case managers for the DDA system, are there specific CCS responsible for completing the community settings questionnaire, or are all CCSs doing them?
That's a great question. The expectation is that all CCSs will complete CSQs with the folks that they support. But again, to reiterate what we've talked about, completing that in collaboration with the person from their perspective, the provider, and then of course any technical assistance that may be needed from DDA. Like I said, we don't want these completed in isolation or in silos.
Thank you, Leslie. The next question is, what is the process if one CCS says the site is not compliant, but another CCS says the same site is compliant? So as you're addressing that, can you also talk about the intent of the CSQ in terms of the experience of the person?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So as we've discussed, the CSQ is absolutely tied to site compliance, but it needs to be completed from the person's perspective. And as we mentioned, what an environment feels like to me might be completely different in the same environment for Rhonda. So it's important to remember that that's why we want to use that validation process. So we can really kind of dig in, have that dialogue about what's going on in the site. I'm going to use an example that I heard recently, and this is a simpler example, but I think it kind of illustrates what's being asked here. There might be a person who we know loves going to Taco Bell, goes to Taco Bell every single day. It's their favorite thing to do. But then when asked about going to Taco Bell, they might say they don't like it and they don't ever go. But as the provider, you know that that is absolutely their favorite thing to do. So that's going to prompt us all to go back and really have dialogue again about the true nature of the person's environment and looking at all of that to determine what the sort of ultimate answer is.
Great, thank you, Leslie. Our next question is, who can verify an agency's compliance status if the agency hasn't received any communications yet from DDA?
That is an excellent question. These are all great questions. So we are, along with Lisa and her office, we are working to make sure that all providers get a sort of status letter, if you will, that will outline all of your sites and whether or not each site is compliant or non-compliant. So we will be working on that to make sure that everybody feels grounded in where they are to this point.
Thank you. Our next question is related to direct support professional shortages. So there may be factors that limit the ability for people to access their community as they choose due to these staff shortages. maybe available resources or other things. How should these factors be considered when answering the community settings questionnaire?
Absolutely. So I think there's a couple things that you want to look at here. First of all, I think there's a big difference between can't and won't, right? Across the country, everyone is struggling with an unprecedented staffing shortage. So there are things that are just not possible right now. So you can use that as an opportunity, again, so going back to that validation piece for one, and determining what the reason is for that. And, there are some things that are completely out of our control. But also using that as an opportunity to make sure that your policies and procedures really detail and talk about what you want your staff doing as far as helping folks be more active in their communities. So, in the end, when we hopefully come out of this awful staffing shortage, you are well poised to sort of, get back to hitting the ground running and getting folks out and active in their community.
Thank you. Our next question is, are you able to share more information on the exact nature of documentation needed to verify the requirement question that says, does the person have a lease or other legally enforceable agreement? What kind of documentation would that be?
A copy.
Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
I was going to say, hi, a copy of the lease or the residential agreement.
Great, and as we know, people may live on their own, they may be in supported living, or they may be in community living, and if that's the case, then that's what Lisa's referring to, the agreement with the provider or their own lease. Leslie, there's a question about CCS entities getting training. I'm wondering if there will be a deeper level training on completing the CSQ and a suggestion for periodic ongoing training to support new CCSs coming in.
Absolutely. We recognize that is something that needs to occur, and we've gotten feedback on that even prior to this webinar today. So we are working to finalize training, and we want to get some additional feedback from our CCSs, but that will absolutely be coming, and I appreciate the suggestion of doing periodic trainings.
Thank you. And one of our questions, and that we're asking in those settings, it relates to people having the right to choose their provider of services. The question is that related to the provider overall or the specific staff that is supporting the person?
It really applies to all of the above. We want folks to be able to have the choice of who supports them in their setting, whether it be at their home, their day program, whatever that looks like. But we also want to make sure that folks are aware that they can change their services if they want to. They can change their provider if they want to. So it's all of those things, and making sure that people are aware of their rights to make those choices.
Great. Our next question is, there may be some restrictions, such as alarms on a door to alert them for potential elopement, that may not be able to ever be restored due to the health and safety concerns of the individual. How will something like that be considered regarding a right restoration process?
Excellent question. So the majority of us, I'm sure there are a lot of us that will run into that type of scenario. And it's, as we all know, any type of restriction, which really would amount to a no in the CSQ, any type of restriction needs to really, it needs to outline what that is, why it's in place, what least restrictive measures have been tried before getting to that type of support or restriction. You know, it needs to be measurable. We need to see progress. So even if the progress is incremental, or it's, you know, not something that's perhaps ever going to be restored. I mean, you know, ultimately that's what we're always working towards, but you know, in some situations that may, you know, be a long time off. It's just really important to constantly be documenting, showing what steps the person is working towards to hopefully be able to work towards a less restrictive situation, and really showing the data that supports that. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Lisa, this question we'd like you to share your thoughts on. So some providers may have received a compliance letter back in 2017 and are wondering if another letter would be sent to validate that they're compliant. Another provider was wondering about when can they anticipate receiving letters after submitting a response to the last non-compliance letter. Can you share with the audience the department's plan related to sharing information with providers on their compliant and non-compliant sites and services?
Sure, thank you. We are currently working on all of the letters for compliance and for non-compliance. I believe there were non-compliant letters sent out between June and July, and those letters were emailed to provider settings and to sites. So those providers who are still working with our team will receive another letter within that time frame that was outlined. So there is an expectation to receive a letter by the end of October or the beginning of November. So there will be a letter sent to all providers for whatever status they are in.
Thank you, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
Leslie, we've got a couple questions related to the community settings questionnaire again. One of them wants to, one of our audience members wants to know when the CCS starts completing the community settings questionnaire. And then another person wanted us to clarify the provider's role in completing the community settings questionnaire, noting that it seems to be mainly the CCS's responsibility.
Sure. So the CCS should be completing it prior to the APD, and making sure it's completed along with the annual PCP. Excuse me, and or within 30 days if a person moves to a new home or a new day program. That's important to know. As far as the provider's role in this process, you're correct that really the CCS is facilitating this conversation, right? They're facilitating and working with the person to make sure that it's being completed from the perspective of that person. However, there needs to be verification involved by the CCS. So part of that verification process of the responses in the CSQ from the person will be having conversations with the provider to kind of verify the information that's been discussed, looking at policies and procedures to make sure that you know, everything kind of aligns, if you will. And you know, if there are no's in that CSQ that aren't able to sort of be hashed out, if you will, between the CCS and the provider, you know, that's why we're putting in that validation piece by the regional office. So we're collaborating and making sure that everybody feels grounded in where they are for that particular CSQ, that particular site.
Thank you. Lisa, you can help us with this question. The question is the compliance by person or by site? So if a provider got a letter, is it by person or by site that compliance is considered and applied?
It is considered by the site.
Next question, Leslie, if a provider only provides employment services and no longer has day program services, does the home and community-based service final rule still apply?
If services are community-based, like what you are describing, the presumption is that you're meeting the spirit of the community settings rule. With that being said, folks still will have CSQs completed. And so if there is something in that CSQ that's flagged as a no, that should really spark a conversation between the CCS and the provider, regardless of the service and the service setting.
Thank you, Leslie. So this is a question related to the lease question, right? So if a person says they don't have a lease, for example, but then when the CCS talks with the provider and they have completed this, would the CCS say yes to lease or no? Would they comment at the end that the CCS got a copy of the lease from the provider? Can you share a little bit about your thoughts related to if a person said they didn't have a lease, but the CCS followed up and had that dialogue with the provider and verified that in fact that lease was available or a service agreement? What would the CCS indicate on the form given there was a discrepancy there?
Sure. So, you know, like I said before, this is one of the more common areas of noncompliance that we are seeing, and that has happened. That has happened, that the provider has come back and said, well, no, we do have this. They've signed it. You know, here it is. So again, using that verification method and getting that information from the provider, one, it would be important to make sure that it is notated in the CSQ if it hasn't already been submitted. If it hasn't been submitted and that's the only no answer that's kind of keeping it from being compliant, we would want the CCS to go back and complete a new CSQ to reflect the correct information. I also want you to really use that as an opportunity to educate the person that you support, you know, to show them, you know, you do have a lease. This is what it's for. This is why it exists. So kind of the nuts and bolts of making sure that the CSQ is accurate in the system, but then also using that as a really great opportunity to make sure the person knows what their rights are, what they have in place, and the why.
Great. So today we heard in the process that if a site or a community settings questionnaire came back as non-compliant, that the CCS and the DDA would be supporting that provider, verifying that information, and in fact, if there was some changes that needed to be made, that technical assistance would be provided by the DDA. There's a question here that relates to if a non-compliance was determined, a letter was sent, and the provider sends information back into the department. Lisa, can you share your anticipated timeline for when the department would be sending a letter back to the provider, letting them know the findings based on that remediation plan and documentation that they submitted to the department?
Sure. Of course, we would review the information sent in and then vet that with the DDA. We would hope that that process would not be longer than a 30-day period.
Great. There was another question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, and it would be prior to the October 31st date.
Great. There was another question noting that Leslie mentioned that the provider should be part of completing the CSQ, but on slide 9, it states the CCS and the person completes the CSQ. I believe, Leslie, you have been saying that the CCS facilitates the completion of the community settings questionnaire, and that they should be engaging in dialogue with the provider, right, to validate anything that would be a potential indicator of non-compliance. Do you want to confirm or elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So that's correct. So ultimately, it's really starting and sort of finishing with the CCS, working with the person and completing that from the person's perspective. However, there should be provider involvement. There needs to be provider involvement to verify the answers to the CSQ and as a an opportunity to work collaboratively if things need to be remediated or supports need to be put in place. We will be really finalizing those details and including those in policies and standard operating procedures. As I said, that process flow is really kind of a 10,000 foot level, if you will. So we're using the feedback and questions we received today to really kind of help us inform the finalization of those things. But we really want the provider involved in that process to make sure things are accurate and the person is being supported as best they can.
Great, thank you. Lisa, I'm going to ask this question, and Leslie, you can add to it if you'd like to, but the question is, what happens from a licensing perspective if a site has conflicting community settings rule compliance reports? Will the site be able to remain licensed? So if there are 3 people living in a group home and one of the 3 individuals, there's been a determination of non-compliance, will that site be able to continue to remain licensed, or does that impact all of them because the site, one of the persons in the site has been determined non-compliant?
So the home and community-based settings rule is only it only refers to Medicaid and that Medicaid number. This does not affect the site's license. That license will remain intact.
Okay, and Lisa, and Leslie, I'm going to pull you into this, just to clarify that each DDA group home is licensed and has a licensed Medicaid number associated with it. So in fact, if the home or the site or the day program was determined non-compliant, then that will affect their license. Leslie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so we touched on this a little bit previously, but it very well may happen that you have 3 people living in a home. They've all had a CSQ completed. 2 of them result in compliance notification, but 1 results in a non-compliant. And so again, we really want to have that spark conversation amongst the CCS, the provider, the person, the DDA regional office, because we want to try and remediate that as best we can. Ultimately, it could absolutely result in maybe there was some misinformation, or verification resulted in kind of flipping, if you will, that non-compliant to a compliance. But to sort of reiterate what Lisa said, the OHCQ license it would not necessarily or technically be affected by the CSR compliance. Those things they're not necessarily tied together. And I don't know, we may need to have some further discussion so we can clarify that answer a little bit more. So that's a good question to ask, so we can know to hash, or not hash that out, excuse me, but just make sure we're getting clear information out there as possible.
Right, so the department would verify, right? If there's conflicting information, the department would work with the provider and the team to verify the information before the final determination of compliance or non-compliance would be made. We heard today that the provider would get a letter related to that and have the opportunity to create a remediation plan to be submitted to the department with an additional 30-day grace period if needed, so that they could get that in. But once the department makes that decision and any supporting documentation after the remediation plan has been determined, then the department would advise the provider of the final finding as we get close to that March 2023 compliance. So I know we are at 10 o'clock, and I'm going to see Nick, if you're on and would like to offer some closing remarks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Sorry, I was having technical difficulties at the beginning, but Leslie did, I think, a great job going through that. I think, you know, looking at a lot of the questions, again, I just want to reiterate, I appreciate all of these questions as we start finalizing our process. And I think it's just important for us all to remember, you know, I'm seeing some of the anxiety in the questions, right? Our goal here is compliance. Our goal is to work with folks. Our goal is to make sure that we're not continually running into these non-compliant situations or sites. And I think you can see by the data that was shared earlier, that's happening. I mean, for the most part, the vast majority of our system is compliant. And we are committed to working with all of you to make sure that those few that aren't, that we get clarification on that, and we make sure that we get the necessary documentation to review that and move forward. I think it's also just important to remember, you're all doing this. You're all working with people, making sure they have choice in their lives, making sure that they get out, making sure that they have access to what they need. You're all doing it. And so I think it's just, I think taking a deep breath and realizing we're doing this and we're going to continue to do it. We're just going to be a little bit more formal about it right now. And our goal is to make sure that these finalized processes get out. And I think to the point of all of you, we are going to make sure that the right training is out there and that you're giving us feedback to make sure that that training is useful and helpful. And even with training, even with processes, procedures, yes, there's still going to be questions and we'll work through them. We're going to work through them. You know, the goal here, like Leslie said when she was going through her slides, is to limit disruption to people. We don't want to disrupt people's lives. And I think that is our ultimate goal here. And we are going to work hand in hand with you to make sure that happens. This is a collaborative process from Medicaid to DDA, to families, to teams, to people, to providers, to CCSs. We're all in this together, and we're gonna get it right together. So I appreciate everyone coming today. Again, I apologize we had to reschedule, but I appreciate every single one of the comments that everyone put in here. We have a wealth of information now to go back and finalize our processes. Thanks, everybody.